President of the Global Bioethics Initiative, I'd like to thank you all for joining us tonight. Nancy Abrahams, HBO, and Rick Estebienstock I'll be congratulated not only for the excellence of this film, but for its graphic demonstration of how desperate people are forced into desperate action. There's a criminal element that is ready and willing to take advantage of their desperation. And as you will soon hear, Jonathan Rattel is showing that aggressive law enforcement can limit their opportunities to do so, but how difficult their job is. Without a doubt, the basic problem is scarcity. However, well-meaning individuals in the same decades that have seen the acceptance of same-sex marriage and assisted suicide have done little to investigate the possible benefits of offering incentives to organ donation as a solution to the problem. Their decisions are largely related to how they see the moral and ethical issues involved, and how they define certain key concepts such as property, altruism, dignity, and self-esteem. I ask you to keep these issues in mind as you listen to the arguments that we presented tonight before and against various actions. I urge you to decide for yourself what these principles mean to you.
I just want to, I'm of course thrilled to be presenting the film here with this kind of an audience. The film is not an advocacy film. We set out to make something that was about this issue, the issue of organ trafficking. And as we journeyed through to all these countries and met all these people, the issue became much more morally complex and ethically ambiguous. And I just felt that that was the real journey that I took with my team, and that was what we wanted the audiences to feel when they watch the film. And I hope that you got that it's really not a black and white issue, merely of exploitation, but a really complex web that is fed by desperation on both sides of the equation. And I thought it was important to understand that. It certainly kind of changed my views about the issue, and now informs everything I think about when I read articles and see pieces on the issue.
The prosecution in Medicus was exceptional, and I think everyone should understand that the clinic itself, a private clinic, was in extremis. It was an extreme situation, and it was not a scenario in which one or two doctors had decided to take matters into their own hands. This, as the indictment disclosed, was an organized criminal group that turned a urology clinic into an organ harvesting scenario. And the predation on the poor and the indigent and the uneducated was exceptional. There were convictions on this case. The owner of the clinic was sentenced to 8 years, his son to 7. The anesthesiology team was sentenced to 3 years for grievous bodily harm, and other convictions have followed in other sentences. And that was the first time that medical practitioners, doctors, had been found to be members of an organized criminal group. And that's exceptional. That's the first time that I'm aware of that that's ever happened in a clinical setting, in a private clinical setting, that criminal convictions for organized crime, for trafficking in humans against medical practitioners. So that was exceptional. But I have to say that it's a very complex issue. The law that I applied was based on a number of UN conventions that are around the world and known, as many of the domestic statutes follow. And it is a very complex issue to understand. I do say that the victims who cannot consent at law are not able to consent to the removal of their organs, were trafficked, were exploited, and many of them did not receive any funds at the end of the day, and many of them have not done well. We considered other charges, as you can imagine, but it was very serious. Dr. Somnus is still out there. We are still hunting him, for lack of a better word, but we remain assertive and firm in the convictions that we received that what we were doing was the right thing. I know there is a moral question about whether the law is correct. I'm not here to question that. My job was to follow the law and apply the law, and I did do that. That law is followed by every country in the world, save except the Islamic Republic of Iran, which apparently is legal to trade and sell and purchase organs. So that would be an indication to many people, I think, that this is a very slippery slope. Maybe the law needs to be reformed, I don't know. That's for someone else. But the law that we applied is based upon general tenets of widely held conventions on trafficking in humans and organized crime.
Just some notes on the film. Common things that seem to be pervasive in the black market organ trade is money. It's all driven by economics, by cash flow. The one exception that was noted was the altruistic donor. And one connection you can see in that donor versus all of the other people who were interviewed in the film was the connection of emotion. There was something very profound that the donor was receiving that went well beyond monetary compensation. And that's what drives the altruism and ethically makes organ donation acceptable. As physicians, we have an obligation to not cause harm to people. Taking someone's organ from them to give to someone else without some sort of benefit, and it has to be a reasonable benefit, it is not just and not ethical to perform as a physician. So the surgeon in the film, you know, that he said, they signed a consent, all I did is my job, I'm basically a technician. That's not the oath that we take as physicians.
Well, oddly enough, this film, powerful as it was, reminded me from a line from Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. Crimes, excuses, and extenuations, where Hobbes says, if by the terror of present death a man endeavors to violate the law, then he is totally excused, because no law can oblige a man to abandon his own reservation. And I would submit for your consideration that our current law and public policy routinely obliges men and women to abandon their own preservation. Dr. Geld is correct. The ethics behind organ donation are indeed complicated and ambiguous. The very first living donor transplant in the United States in 1954 at the Beth Israel Hospital involved Ronald and Richard Herrick. Ronald was the donor. And while the transplant was successful, it is not widely known, but is publicly available for all to see, that Ronald himself nearly died in that procedure. The clamp on the pedicle of the renal artery slipped off while all attention was on the recipient, Richard, and Ronald nearly bled to death. That, again, I would remind you, is in 1954, not too long after the Nuremberg declarations. And had Ronald died or suffered permanent injury, living donor transplantation, indeed transplantation in general, would have been set back a generation. Fortunately, he didn't. And we have the enormous condescension of posterity to look back and think that it all went well, had to go well simply because it did. I'd submit to you, in probably the last 30 seconds that I have, that the negative externalities that the current overall prohibition on pecuniary incentives for organs includes requiring too many of us to abandon our own preservation, and that needs to change.
I'll say one or two things about the purchase and sale of organs. The Medicus Clinic, as I said, was an extreme case. There's no doubt about that. However, it brought to light many of the concerns that the convention talks about, the International Convention on Trafficking in Persons, because the offense really is trafficking in persons, either for sexual slavery, for labor, or for the removal of organs. That's where the domestic legislation comes from. It comes from the UN Convention. And that's what we applied, because it was ripped out of that convention and put into domestic legislation. So it is trafficking in persons. And the difficulty is, it's user paid. The persons that can afford to pay for the kidneys will. And the only persons that would donate, quote, donate, and consent to this process are the indigent, poor, and the absolutely desperate. And their lives are are not made any better. They are suffering grievously as a result of this. So that was the jeopardy that we faced in the prosecution, I think.
I'm going to respond to that. I have to say something, and I think you'll agree with this, and I think I asked you this when we were filming on location. Most of the people, in fact, virtually all of the people that I met, I by no means met everybody who was involved in the trade, but in all the countries that I traveled to, were very willing donors. Were they properly tested? It's black market. So the black market is by definition bad. But we talk about, and you have to define what trafficking is. Everybody talks about these donors as being coerced. And when I question, what does that mean coerced? Because they weren't coerced. The understanding is that they're coerced by their own poverty. And partially, and again, I'm not advocating, I'm just saying because someone is poor, I mean, they're coerced by their own poverty to clean our toilets and to work in mines as well. It doesn't mean by definition that they aren't able to make a decision. I did find that patronizing. Having said that, I just want to make it clear, I believe the black market is a dangerous place. There's no safety net, they're not being tested properly, they may not be told all of the risks. If I wanted to donate my kidney to somebody here, I would be tested once and I would be told of the risks. They might not be, but they might not be as informed, but they aren't coerced. And I just have to say, and this is very anecdotal, I'm not a physician, I just make documentaries, but for some of the people that I met, what I started thinking was, maybe for Eddie Boy, selling his kidney isn't the worst thing in the world. And I felt very weird feeling that. In fact, when the operation got messed up on account of us, I was supposed to feel like, thank God I saved his life, but I felt like I ruined it for him. And then I felt weird that I felt like I ruined it for him. And that was really the epiphany for me, a turning point in the making of the film and informed the edit. But I just have to say that when we talk about it in terms of trafficking and coercion, and that's the language that I see everywhere, but it's not the same as sex trafficking, and it's not the same as forced labor, because that's really people who are trafficked and whose passports are taken away and who aren't paid, and that's a coercion that we use colloquially, and that's how people interpret it when they read the papers and read that people were coerced. Sorry.
Just to respond very quickly to that. That analysis was exactly what our judges in our case focused upon, and it was the slippery slope. It was the hardest thing to prove, that these people had been coerced when we had witnesses who, by video link, testified that they willingly did this. But the law, as it states, says that the issue of consent is vitiated, it is destroyed by payment. As soon as you make payment, the person cannot consent. That's what the law says. You cannot agree to sell your organs. That's the state of the law at the moment. So as soon as the payment was made, the only thing the prosecutor needed to prove beyond that was some element of coercive behavior. And that was proved, as I believe I understand the court decision, by this inequality of bargaining power between the rich and the poor, is that there could never be a true bargain, because the rich could always harvest the poor. That, at the bottom of it, was what grounded the convictions.
From a medical standpoint, when you have money waved in someone's face, all of a sudden you have medical issues arise. People will not tell the truth. They'll just outright lie in order to become a candidate. So that's not good for the recipient, and certainly not good for the donor. And for someone to provide consent to understand what they're really getting into, a lot of money waved in their face makes them blind and deaf to whatever you're telling them. So they're not able to provide that.
I actually take offense to that statement.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that too. I'd have to say that watching a loved one suffer on dialysis would render one equally willing to say more or less whatever one would have to say in order to relieve them. So, I mean, it's certainly the case that pecuniary interests can interfere with judgment in some cases, but so do the direct witness of suffering with a loved one.